Welcome back to the Hard Truth Distilling Company studios. This segment is brought to you by The Ugly Grouper.
Welcome back, Indiana Sports Beat Radio here on this Friday. A big sports weekend coming ahead for Indiana, for the Colts, for a lot of people at Big Ten. A lot of Big Ten games going on, Zach. Basketball tonight as Indiana with their final tune-up exhibition game, but more importantly, it's more of a homecoming for Pat Knight, the newly minted head coach for the Marion Knights, and I had him on the show yesterday. It was awesome. He is loving it. He's glad to be back. He is enjoying the fact that he's going to get to come to Bloomington to Assembly Hall. Actually, going to be in the opponent's locker room for just the second time. He told me, and first time being when he was being recruited by Clem Haskins, and so he got to go over there for a recruiting visit once, but it's just it continues to be a bringing back together of the Indiana basketball family, which was fractured for so long.
Yeah, and obviously I think people will remember too, Steve Downing is the athletic director at Marion, and that his ties. I think Mike Woodson was talking either last year or the year before about how when he was young, he'd go over to Steve Downing's house, and Steve Downing's wife, I think Mike Woodson's words were, make a big old pot of chili. And they, that I think those relationships have endured strongly to this day. And so I think it's just kind of a deepening of, in many ways that program, Marion, not Indiana, but that program's ties to IU basketball and to the things that it means to any number of people. So I'm sure it'll be a special moment for Pat coming back, and I suspect it'll be a special moment for Mike Woodson because obviously his relationship with the Knight family remains strong, for many, many, many years.
And then of course that's all good and fun for some basketball fans in Indiana. We'll get into their regular season coming up, which a few more I'll call tune-up games, although they are real games. But then they get into a stiff test, which we'll get to talk about that because that's the ways to come. But they're going to get a quick test early when they head to the Bahamas.
I mean, that's going to be not just a quick test, but I mean, it's going to be the most important, frankly, sequence on their non-conference schedule. There's really not. I mean, unless South Carolina surprises a lot of people, Indiana's not going to face anything, like really quality-wise at all in the non-conference outside of Atlantis. And that was one reason why, maybe not from an NCAA tournament perspective, but simply from a learned perspective, the perspective of how you test yourself and get better. That's what I think made the Tennessee exhibition so important. But from a tournament perspective, from a resume perspective, the trip to Atlantis, the trip to the Bahamas is hugely important for this team to add some quality to its NCAA tournament resume with some non-conference neutral site wins on those 3 days in late November, because if Indiana doesn't do it there, it's not likely to do it anywhere. And then you are really in a position where Indiana is going to have to sort of make hay while the sun shines on the back of its Big Ten schedule, which isn't impossible, obviously, but you're not going to want to go into the Big Ten with absolutely nothing in hand from a non-conference perspective for your NCAA tournament resume. You are going to want, and borderline need, to be able to lean on something before you get to Big Ten play that begins to build out that resume so that when you do get to Selection Sunday, you're not just asking them to look at a bunch of empty calorie non-conference games and what you did in the conference.
And then, of course, basketball or football this weekend. Big news coming last night on Inside Indiana Football. Kurt Signetti's radio show, as he made the announcement that, very casually, I might add, that Kurtis Rourke will start tomorrow and play the game, which is great news for Indiana football fans, but also great news as they continue to fight the brand bias. We have not seen how that will actually affect the college football playoff poll, as that poll, first one, comes out following this game, a couple of days following this game. So we're going to get a better idea. There's definitely been brand bias in the AP poll, but we will see how much that is carried over. I was on the teleconference this week with the executive director for the college football playoffs, and I asked him that very question. How are fans going to be assured that it's not about what's on your jersey? It's about the teams like Indiana, how they not going to be looked over, and they give you the we're looking for the best teams routine and all that. But at the end of the day, we know that that's not that it's not that it's not true. It is also true that there is brand bias, and but it's going to be awfully difficult to keep an 11-1 Indiana team out, but it's not going to be impossible. But the easy way to do that is just take care of business and keep winning. The next opportunity comes, and they're probably their toughest test because they're going to be playing in front of 80,000 people this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, with Rourke, I think it's hugely important that Kurtis Rourke is back, and I think that kind of goes without saying. But I think it's funny. You kind of go back and look now at, the Big Ten statistics, and despite the fact that he has played one game less than all of his competitors in the everybody else in the top five, he's still in the top five in the conference in passing yards. He's still second in completion percentage. He leads the conference in yards per attempt. He's tied for fourth in the conference in touchdowns. And again, he's tied the only player who's also played 7 games and has more touchdown passes than him is Will Howard at Ohio State. Rourke's 3 interceptions are, let's say, tied for least among qualified passers. Nobody with at least 150 pass attempts has thrown that few interceptions. Rourke's quarterback rating is still the highest in the conference. And one of the things that I bring up a lot is he's doing a lot of what he's doing on 25.9 attempts per game. That is 11th. That is tied with Will Howard for 11th in the conference. So when you see Billy Edwards with more passing yards, or Miller Moss, or even Dylan Gabriel, who I think is having an outstanding season, you have to remember that, like, Moss, for example, is throwing the ball 13 times more a game than Rourke is, and Rourke is still putting up comparable sort of per game averages and per game numbers. It is a remarkable season that he's having, and he is, the strength of this Indiana team is its depth, its balance. But if there is one player who is kind of the linchpin, the one Indiana can least afford to lose, it's Kurtis Rourke. To your point about the college football playoff, I generally, I've gotten some of that with people too. And, I sometimes, I don't know if it's brand bias. It is hard to get up the AP poll. As someone who used to vote in the college basketball poll, it is hard to get up the AP poll late into the season, simply because you get to a point where stuff has started to calcify. Teams that were ranked in the preseason have moved their way up and started to entrench themselves, and teams just don't lose that often in the top 10, top 12, especially in this world we live in now, where the biggest conferences, not everybody plays each other. So Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana, 3 of the recognized 4 best teams in the Big Ten this season, will not play each other unless 2 of them meet in Indianapolis. What I have told people when they brought up the brand bias thing is basically wait for the college football playoff rankings and see where Indiana is then, and get a sense for the committee's decision-making process. Because let's be fair, Indiana has, we put together something today about basically could Indiana make the Big Ten championship game with a loss. And the answer is it's pretty difficult. The trouble that Indiana is going to get into, just to use this as an example. So if we wind up in a situation where there are 3- and 4-way ties, we'll work down through some tiebreakers, and you can get to one, which is opponent's conference record. At the moment, if you keep Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana all in the same bucket, and obviously they played different numbers of games, or maybe they haven't, I'm not sure. I think they have. Ohio State's opponents are 26 and 18. Oregon's are 18 and 25. Penn State's are 18 and 26. Indiana's are 15 and 28. So, and that's common opponents, so basically teams in the conference. But it is a way of illustrating Indiana has played a softer schedule, and there's no arguing against that. The question on the backside is, how does the committee feel about a team that maybe has played a softer schedule, but has really steamrolled some of the teams that it's played? Indiana is winning its games by an average of 32.4 points per game. Even if you remove the Western Illinois game, you set that to one side, you say that was an FCS opponent, etc. The other 7 games, Indiana's still winning by an average of more than 26 points. And that's where I think, when I say wait for the committee, I suspect if Indiana wins this weekend, Indiana will be higher up the committee's rankings than it is in the polls. I also think that when you do talk about brand bias, I think it can work both ways. I do think that Indiana can win more respect by winning these next 2 games, because it is Michigan State on the road and it is Michigan at home. Whatever their current state, the brand of those programs, I think, could change some perceptions a little bit. But in general, what I'm trying to say is I do think there's a decent chance we get to the first committee rankings, and if Indiana wins at Michigan State, it's in a better position than what it's perceived to be in the polls right now. And I think that's why Indiana fans, like when I talk to them, I just say, just relax and it'll be fine.
And of course, it's going to be interesting to see if there's been any drop off with Kurtis Rourke's play. He's been out for, I guess, a week and a half is what you'd call it. But how does he step right back in there? Of course, he's fortunate because this offense is running, hitting on all cylinders in every other way. The running game has not missed a beat. As a matter of fact, they relied on the running game in the second half of last week's win to kind of seal that game away and kind of flex their muscles a little bit with that. So it'll be interesting to see if he can just step right back into being Kurtis Rourke, or is it kind of an ease-in situation?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Michigan State has not been great shakes defending the run this season. So, and, I know that it didn't quite work out 1-to-1 with, how Nebraska or how Washington had struggled against the run, and Indiana didn't just, walk out there and start tearing off big strips. But eventually, obviously, Indiana did get to a place where I think it got 188 and, some important scores on the ground. Michigan State, if you look at it, they allowed 5.3 yards per carry and 185 yards to Ohio State. They allowed 5.76 yards per carry and 213 yards to Oregon. They only allowed 133 yards to Iowa, but they still allowed almost 5.8 yards per carry. All 3 of those teams rushed for multiple touchdowns against Michigan State. It's worth saying the Spartans were a lot better against the run against Michigan. Now, you can sort of choose your own adventure on that. Michigan is a pretty good run team, has been for a while. On the one hand, you can give Michigan State some credit. Michigan is averaging 172.6 a game. They've been one of the better rushing teams in the conference. You can give the Spartans some credit for slowing that down. On the other hand, that could also be a function of, Michigan getting to a place where you can just load the box and force them to pass because you just don't have to respect it at all. And Michigan winds up winning that game, and so maybe that game plan doesn't quite work. But Michigan State was a lot better in that game. 3.8 yards per carry, 3.8 and change, only the 1 touchdown, 31 carries for 119 yards. Really did not let Michigan establish the run game against them. What I would say is, statistically speaking, when Michigan State has faced opponents at the level that Indiana is operating at right now, it has struggled to stop the run, and it has struggled to kind of keep keep teams off schedule against the run. And that has been, I think, a big part of the reason why Michigan State is one of the worst teams, not just in the conference, but in the country, trying to get off the field on third downs. Michigan State is 116th nationally, allowing a conversion rate of 44.86% on opponent third down attempts. And I bring both those numbers up to illustrate that, to your point about Kurtis Rourke, if you don't want to give him too much, if you don't want to push him in too quickly or too early, you may have the option to run the ball, set yourself up in some favorable down and distance situations, and kind of go from there. Now, we saw Indiana not afraid to pass the ball with Taven Jackson last week. I think there was a message there that just sort of said this offense passes the ball. That's what we do. That's how we move the ball. That's how we're structured. But I do think that Indiana might have some openings to take a little bit of the workload off Kurtis Rourke if it needs to, frankly. I mean, if it doesn't, then, then we don't, then this is an academic conversation. But if for any reason it needs to, then it has that opportunity.
Well, brother, we appreciate you. And I'm sure we'll see you tonight or this weekend sometime. And make sure you're giving Zach a follow and be a subscriber. Keep local papers alive. Appreciate you as always, sir.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jim.